and then a couple of days later, he's writing this Feuilleton. So the Feuilleton is connected to the news of the day, right? Feldman goes from one person to the next and scares them, presumably revealing what is really on their mind, which often goes against their outward appearance. Okay, so halfway through the Feuilleton, the narrator asks with a mixture of suspense, wit, and self-irony, and I, if Mr. Feldman will read my mind and expose what I really think about mind readers, who know how will I fare? But then Feldman ends his performance of mind reading, and the dances and the music start again. The narrator can't stand the heat in the dancing hall, and he goes out with his friend to the library, to the reading room, where they are engrossed in a lively conversation about what is really on their mind, which is Heinrich von Treitschke, third volume of a large book, The History of Germany in the 19th Century, which was just published and was a topic of much discussion and debate. Frischmann's narrator is furious with Treitschke, the prolific nationalist German historian, because he deemed the over-representation of Jewish journalists and writers to be a dangerous threat to Germany's politics, press, and literature. Frischmann takes issue with the way Treitschke's anti-Semitism influenced his evaluation of the writing, especially of Heinrich Heine. According to Treitschke, Heine, with his Feuilleton style, quote, was the first to throw down the barriers which must separate between poetry and prose, to develop the Feuilleton, which according to him is a superficial yet accomplished style with easy to consume characters, to take the foam from this French passion drink and bring it from Paris to Germany. Treitschke wrote against Heine's internationalist fellows. Of course, when we hear something like internationalist fellows, we know that this is a code for Jews who are engaged in newspaper enterprise. And this was echoed very soon by the literary critic Adolf Bertelt, who claimed that Heine stands for Jews who are the chief representative of Feuilletonism in Germany, which is, quote, at the bottom corruption, and which takes the French literature and French journalistic model as its ideals. Now, Frischmann's narrator writes that Treitschke was incapable of recognizing that Heine was the greatest German writer since Goethe, quote, and implies that Heine's feuilletons were great achievements, one which became a model for his own writing. So Frischmann's 1886 Hebrew Feuilleton was also ars poetic. It was a feuilleton about feuilleton, about the hybrid nature between poetry and prose, between journalism and literature, between fact and fiction, between high and low, between describing urban scenes in St. Petersburg and cultural criticism. It is about the possibilities of the feuilleton, its pitfalls, as well as this curious association between feuilletons and Jewishness that hover around Frischmann's playful and urbane text. David, if you can move forward. So 24 years later, in 1910, Frischmann, at this point influential writer, poet, translator, editor, and critic, published another feuilleton in the Warsaw-based Hebrew newspaper Hatzfira with the title Rak Feuilletonistan, only feuilletonists. He wrote there that the feuilleton should be understood no less than a modernist form of poetry written by poets who deliberately choose not to express themselves in line consisting of 4 iambic feet. The feuilleton, says Frischmann, is short, subjective, playful, and ephemeral, but also vast, as it touches on any philosophical, social, literary, or cultural issue of the modern age. Moreover, The accomplished feuilletonist is a writer who has a כישרון המיוחד לדבר בקלות על כל עניין כבד, a special talent to speak lightly about weighty matters. Frischman wrote this feuilleton Herzl, who just died a few months before. These are two Jewish writers who excelled at writing feuilletons in Hebrew and German at the end of the 19th century in Vienna and Odessa. About Herzl feuilletons, whose model was Heine, Frischman writes that in one line we find more depth, right judgment, a sense of reality, and emotion that can be found in 20 writers. And I want to remind you that Frischman actually was not a Zionist. He actually did not agree with Herzl, but he appreciated Herzl as a feuilleton writer. So how then to write a feuilleton in Hebrew? The question that I placed in the title of my paper is a question that occupied many Jewish writers in the second half of the 19th century and in the 20th century. Of course, the question has more than one meaning. First, it asks what should be a Hebrew translation to the French word feuilleton, a word that is foreign to the ancient language. Now, Jewish writers and journalists were extremely inventive about finding parallels from the language of the Bible, the Mishnah, and other religious texts to the modern French word. They seem to revel in the challenge, competing with each other in the wit and resourcefulness. So sometimes it's called עלה נידף, ירקטון, אותיות פורחות, עלי חמד, צלוחית של פלייטון, each one giving a biblical or Mishnaic name to it. But the second meaning of the question, the broader and more significant one, is how the feuilleton was adapted in the Hebrew and the Jewish press. Why? What was the function and the utility of the feuilleton? Is there a good reason why so many Jewish writers devoted much time and energy to writing feuilletons, often side by side with poems, novels, short stories, or philosophical and political works? Does the fact that these prominent Jewish figures who wrote feuilleton in Hebrew, Yiddish, German, Russian, French, Polish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, make these feuilletons Jewish, or even make the feuilleton a Jewish genre? So I'm going to step back now and talk a little bit about the history of the feuilleton. And David, if you can move forward. As is well known, the feuilleton did not start as anything Jewish at all. It began its life in Paris around 1800, shortly after the French Revolution. As you know, I'm sure, with the French Revolution, there was a real boom of journalism. And then with the political instability, with the rise of Napoleon and the counter-revolution, there was censorship again in France. The number of newspapers was in decline, and the freedom of press was tourniqueted. The result of this process, all these processes, was the reduction of newspapers and political news, but also the creation of new hybrid forms of literature and journalism, such as feuilletons. This happened when anything cultural was seen as politically neutral and non-threatening, as opposed to the news of the day, which is all about politics, right? So the word feuilleton is really a diminutive of feuillet, a leaf or page. So feuilleton simply means small leaf. At first, the feuilleton was a sheet added to the newspaper with a variety of short articles and announcements on events in Paris. And then in 1800, and this is what you see in the slide, instead of being a detachable addition to the newspaper, the feuilleton became part of it, yet still visibly marked as different by a line. This happened on the pages of the Parisian newspaper, the Journal de Débat, which was acquired and edited by the Bertin brothers, and a theater critic by the name of D. Geoffrey wrote many of these early feuilletons in the journal, occupying what the French called the ground level floor or below the line. it indicated that the Feuilleton could be cut off and read separately, independent from the rest of the newspaper and the political news that were subject to censorship. Thus, the Feuilleton was launched as an all-encompassing feature. Articles of cultural criticism, literary, polemical, and scientific nature, as well as stories, sketches, travel accounts, local reportage, poetry, etc. All these diverse forms of writing could be published as a Feuilleton. However, the Feuilleton did not really come from nowhere. It was connected with what during the Enlightenment period was known as the Moral Weekly, the Moralisches Wochenblatt, which was the first popular journals of the Enlightenment period. The Feuilleton fulfills a similar function at the beginning of the 19th century as an urban genre of the new mass-oriented press. Now, this newspaper, the Journal de Débat, expanded readership mainly because of the Feuilleton to 32,000 subscribers and made a huge profit of 200,000 francs a year. Thus, it is a little surprise that the Feuilleton spread very quickly from Paris to other cities such as Köln, Berlin, Hamburg, and then to Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Warsaw, as well as cities in the Ottoman Empire and really all over the world. So the newspaper Feuilleton was a hybrid genre between high and low culture, between journalism and literature. It was read by many people who found it interesting, entertaining, and instructive, which made the new form attractive to many writers and to the editors and owners of newspapers. The Feuilleton, however, meant different things to different people in different places. It's also difficult to establish how exactly it moved from one city and one language to another. This is because feuilletons were not always called feuilletons, were not always marked visually below the line, sometimes yes, sometimes no, and were written by people who did not sign their names, using either pseudonyms or publishing anonymously. So sometimes we don't even know who is the writer of this field. It is clear, though, that the Feuilleton was a phenomenon of urban culture related to the proliferation of the popular press and the expansion of the public sphere in the modern metropolis. Now, of course, the notion of the public sphere, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, according to Jürgen Habermas' formulation, is the sphere of private people who come together as a public, or as a realm of a social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed. The public sphere was dependent upon spaces like coffee houses, which I wrote a lot about, and new means of communication like newspapers, which facilitated a transition from journalism of private men of letters, which was in the 17th and 18th century, to the public consumer services of the mass media, quote, which really happened in the 19th century. So the vitality of the public sphere was dependent on the independence of the press, which has constantly to navigate between state control, censorship on one hand, and commercialization on the other. Now, the history of the Jewish press, which is a huge, very important topic, and the presence of Jews in European press represent a microcosm of a complex transnational Jewish public sphere. The content, the form, and the language employed by 19th century Jewish journalists, as well as the newspapers' publication, reflect the development of Jewish political, cultural, and economic sensibility. And I know that among the listeners here, there are many people who work on the Jewish press. As Lilian Weisberg argues, acculturated Jews were attracted to journalism in German and Austrian cities because they saw the new arena of the press, which was open to them, as an opportunity for publication, and they excelled in writing feuilletons, earning both enemies and admirers. Although the first feuilleton in German was probably published in Köln, which is close to France, Heinrich Heine is usually credited as the father of the German feuilleton. Heine's first Feuilleton, which you can see here, is called Briefe aus Berlin, Letters Out of Berlin. It was published in 1822 without Heine's name. It was anonymous. And it's an interesting text. Throughout the text, Heine subtly, very subtly links Berlin urban spaces. He takes the readers on a tour of Berlin, places like coffee houses, the stock market, the university, with the presence of Jews, with anti-Jewish sentiment, as well as restrictions on Jews, on free speech, on students' organization, the press, and literature. He does it without making his cultural and political criticism explicit in the text that was still subject to censorship. So he had to be very careful in what he says, and writing this new genre of the Feuilleton enabled him to do it. The link between the Feuilleton, Jewishness, censorship, and controversial political questions was also evident in the writing of Heine's contemporary, Ludwig Börne, which was born as Loeb Baruch. The link was clear to younger Jewish writers who saw Heine and Börne as inspiration and model. One of them was Moritz Gottlieb Safir, who was born to an observant Yiddish-speaking Jewish family near Budapest and studied in a yeshiva in Prague. In 1825, he moved to Berlin, where he wrote many feuilletons in self-published newspapers. Feuilleton that became known as Berliner Witz, the Berliner humor. It was a journalistic display of biting wit that was very popular with the reading public. So unlike Heine and Börne, Safir's writing were decidedly middlebrow. They didn't try to do high literature. However, it functioned as an alternative political forum amid the censorship of the period. Now, many people understood this Berliner Witz, specifically as Judenwitz, something that is Jewish, human. While highly popular, it represented to critics, quote, many people wrote about it, the disability of Jews to master German and the dubious quality of the journalistic and literary pursuits and their intentions. So there was a lot of suspicions about that. If you can move to the next slide, David. Thank you. So Safir moved to Vienna in 1834, and he established in the journal Der Humorist, the humorist, and edited until his death in 1858. His feuilletons and sketches of Vienna in this period exude mock pathos, and he was able to be both popular and critical at the same time. So in the German and Austrian cultural domain, many people understood the link that was already established between the feuilletons of Heine, Börne, and Safir, and Jewishness and modernity. As the quote that I started with from Treitschke and Bartels make clear. In the early 20th century, when feuilletons enjoyed unprecedented popularity, the writer and critic Karl Kraus, a Viennese journalist and writer of Jewish origins, was highly critical of the feuilleton. Kraus pronounced that no feuilleton without Heine, and he charged Heine for loosening the corset of the German language by introducing the French disease of the feuilleton. So there was a lot of controversy around that. Now, most Jews in the 19th century, of course, did not live in Germany or Austria, but in Eastern Europe. And while many read German newspapers, they were also familiar with and influenced by Russian and Polish feuilletons. The Russian feuilleton was first introduced in St. Petersburg in the newspaper Northern Bee in the 1830s. Viktor Shklovsky, the well-known theorist and historian, defines the Russian feuilleton as something in between an article of practical characters, which recounts facts, and what one would call a work of imaginative literature. Katya Dianina shows that the emergence of the Russian feuilleton was motivated by the development of the mass circulation press and the growth of the reading public. The open dialogue with the reader was conducted by writers who amuse, advise, and otherwise took care of the readership. The broadly accessible Feuilleton functioned as a guide to popular culture and a forum for public opinion in an era of reforms in the Russian Empire. The Feuilleton became common both in the high culture of what the Russians call the thick journals, and also the middle brow culture of the popular daily press. And one very prominent example is Dostoevsky, who wrote in the St. Petersburg journal the 4 feuilletons that make up his Petersburg Chronicle in 1857. So by the 1860s, acculturated Jews in the Russian Empire and maskilim were familiar with the Feuilleton, as well as the new development of the Roman Feuilleton. So a few years after, people started to publish in the newspapers Roman Feuilleton, which is really serial fiction. And I'm not going to talk much about it, but maybe later on we can talk about it in the Q&A. So East European maskilim, they saw themselves as new leadership elite, challenging the traditional authority of rabbis and communal institutions. Perhaps because of the special status of the written word in Jewish traditional society, the maskilim created a new public sphere, which was linked through the new vehicle of the press, that saw itself as a mediator between the people and the state, as well as between different Jewish transnational communities in weeklies and dailies written in many languages. And maybe later we can talk how through that it also moved to places in the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim countries as well, which I don't talk about here at all. So as I'm sure many of you know, the East European Jewish press in Russia became fully developed in Odessa. The first Jew, David, can you move to the next slide? The first Jew to publish feuilletons, okay, thanks, in Russia was Osip Rabinovich in 1847. He dealt with the Jewish synagogue in Odessa as a symbol of modernization. Rabinovich was one of the founders of the first Russian Jewish newspaper, Razvat Don, in Odessa in 1860. In the very same year, 1860, Alexander Zederboim established the first Hebrew newspaper in the Russian Empire, Hamelitz, and 2 years later, in 1862, Kol Mevasser, the first modern Yiddish weekly paper, also appeared as a supplement to Hamelitz and then as independent paper. Eventually, the Russian and Hebrew, the Hebrew, and the Yiddish newspaper in Odessa published feuilletons. Now, the first Hebrew and Yiddish feuilletons were published in Hamelitz and Kol Mevasser in January 1867. The new feuilleton rubric, which appeared in the bottom of page 2 in the paper, was called Aleni Daf. It's a biblical locution that provided a Hebrew translation of the French word feuilleton, and it was written by Tzvi Sharshevsky. Parallel to it, and exactly the same time, Kol Mevasser introduced the Yiddish feuilleton, to which people like Yud Linetsky and Sholem Yankev Abramovich, Mendeley Mocher Sorim, contributed. The Yiddish just used the word feuilleton. That was easy for them to do. They didn't need to translate it into English. Now, the early Hebrew and Yiddish feuilletons were hardly different from other articles of the Haskalah in terms of style and form. But eventually they resemble feuilletons in French, German, and Russian, but with a distinctive Jewish maskilic flavor. Just one example, Reuven Asher Brodes, who used the pseudonym Aviv, published in 1870 a feuilleton entitled Sicha, Sha'ah Achat Acharei HaMavet, a conversation an hour after the death. And it was a conversation between an old rabbi and Yaakov, a new rabbi, in the guise of the Haskalah, the Russian Haskalah, who was appointed by the government. They meet in the world to come an hour after the death and argue about the role of rabbis in the Jewish community. So you can see that political elements that were on the mind of the Maskilim were used in this kind of light-hearted, light-touched text. The appeal of the Feuilleton for the first Russian Hebrew newspaper, Hamelitz, was very clear. It was assumed that it will attract more readers and also be read with pleasure, thus popularizing and disseminating Haskalah ideology, a point that was made explicitly by Zederboim, where he declared that the Feuilleton's positive influence in the Jewish sphere was very successful. Now, in the 1870s, the Hebrew Feuilleton moved from Odessa to Vienna with Peretz Smolensky. This is the next slide, David. By then, the reform initiated following the revolution of 1848, the Feuilleton became established genres in the Viennese newspaper Die Presse and its predecessor, Neue Freie Presse. The master of the Feuilleton at the time was a Jewish journalist and author whose name was David Spitzer. He published from 1865 very popular feuilletons under the title Wiener Spaziergänge, strolls around Vienna, where he mixed quotidian events and impressions of wandering around the city with political and social criticism. Now, Smolensky was familiar with this writing and with the press of Vienna, and he began to experiment with writing Hebrew feuilletons and sketches. Next slide. In 1878, Smolensky established a new short-lived Hebrew weekly journal. Its name was Hamabit, The Spectator, and he published many feuilletons, which he called Alei Chemed. Again, this translation of the feuilleton from French. One example of such feuilleton is called Mishpatei Bnei Adam, The Trials of Men, which takes place before and after the crash of the Viennese stock market in 1873, where many merchants became unemployed, and the question of work suddenly became a topic of conversation in Viennese cafes. The narrator is part of a regular table of the cafes, and he hears the story of a 13-year-old girl from a middle-class family who was forced to peddle in the streets of the city. Next slide. A turning point in the history of the Hebrew Feuilleton was when Yud Lamed Gordon, the very important and prominent Hebrew poet at the time, started to edit Hamelitz, which moved from Odessa to St. Petersburg. Gordon wrote Hebrew feuilletons between 1880 and 1888 under the Talmudic title Tzlochit Shel Feuilleton. He introduced it by writing, and next slide, I'm going to read the Hebrew, but you have the English translation there. צלוחית של פלייטון העמדנו לנו על שולחן המערכת, בא נלקט מעת לעת ומפקידה לפקידה, מכל הבא לידינו, את כל הדבר הקל הצף על פני ים החיים, בין שיהיה חילזון וחרום ימה, או שחלת ואלמוגים, בין שיהיה חלבנה ומלח סדומית וירוקה שעל פני המים. אשרינו אם ירבו הבשמים, וימלאו צלוחיתנו צרי ודבש נכות ולוט, ואוי לנו מפני הבורסקין אם יגדל באשם ותעל צחנתם. Okay, so the idea I think is quite clear. This tzlochit shel feuilleton, the feuilleton jar, is both a mirror of society and a tool for the writer and journalist who might use it to reflect and express correctly the news of the day with the bad and the good, with the sweet and the foul, in order to instruct and guide and shape the public opinion. The Feuilleton gave much flexibility to Gordon, allowing him to comment widely and humorously on events of the day in the voice of a feuilletonist, which was separate from that of an editor and poet. Gordon signed his Feuilletons with the pseudonym Ezov, the hyssop used in the Bible for ritual purification, as well as allegorically to refer to the publication, a purification of the heart. In his Feuilletons, Gordon spoke directly to the reading public, bringing events of the day in the Russian and German press, and mixing them with personal experience and observation, combining narrative and poetry to create a hybrid literary journalistic form. And just around the same time, the Yiddish Feuilleton was developed. For example, the pen name Sholem Aleichem, which many of you are familiar with, actually made its first appearance in 1883 in a satirical Feuilletons published in Das Jiddische Volksblatt, and the title was Die Vibores, the elections. And that was the first time that the name Sholem Aleichem appeared. So by the turn of the 20th century, multilingual Jewish writers embraced the Feuilletons virtually everywhere in Europe, as well as in New York, in Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and in many cities around the world. Feuilletons became what Andreas Hussein, the theorist, has called metropolitan miniatures, modernist short prose pieces that sought to capture the visceral feeling of acceleration and compression, the social conflict and cultural upheaval that define urban experience. The Hebrew Feuilleton blossomed, where Frischman, Nachum Sokolov, Levinsky, Taviyov, Yud Lamed Peretz, and many others wrote in newspapers like Hayom, Amelitz, Hatzfira, Hatzofe, Hazman. These were daily newspapers with a relatively large audience, and Feuilletons also were published in the thick journals such as Hashiloach, which was edited by Achad Ha'am, and Ador, which was edited by Frischman. These Feuilletons were at the heart of Jewish public spheres, and they were also instrumental in the process of making Hebrew more elastic and subtle, turning the high-flown style of the Melitza into a language capable of describing urban scenes, as well as political and social criticism with elegance and wit. It was also in dialogue with Yiddish and German and Russian and French and Polish. Now, this might explain why when the Hebrew press moved from Eastern and Central Europe to Palestine, it was adopted, and we can go now to the next slide. We can see Feuilletons coming up in the socialist Zionist newspaper Hapoel HaTzair, where people like Yosef Chaim Brenner and also some women started to write. You can see here some examples, Ba'agala Feuilleton and Miyomana Shel Yerushalmit. This is the first time that I'm aware of women writing Hebrew Feuilleton. It was also established by the revisionist nationalist newspapers. The Feuilleton appeared in the new daily Hebrew newspaper of the Yishuv, the Var. You can see in the Var there was a Feuilleton, Haaretz, and the Var Hayom, Doar Hayom, sorry. Young journalists such as Uri Keisari, Shmuel Kaiserman wrote wonderful feuilletons describing the young city of Tel Aviv and other cities in mandatory Palestine. And then we start to see important Hebrew poets, people like Yehuda Karni. Can we move to the next slide? Nathan Alterman, writing under the name Aleph Nun and Nagav, and Leah Goldberg, writing under the name Log and Ada Grant. They wrote in the 1930s and 40s journalistic pieces about Tel Aviv and other cities. In these feuilletons, they explored the urban space as well as new cultural realms such as cinema, just putting Tel Aviv in dialogue with Berlin, Paris, and Moscow. And I'm just going to mention it, and maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. We can think of Alterman, Tel Aviv prose sketches, and perhaps even the very famous and highly influential Atur HaShvi'i, the seventh column, as a kind of rhymed Feuilleton. It was a form that blossomed, for example, in the Yiddish press during the interwar period. And, the Atur HaShvi'i became very important for the Yishuv and the new state of Israel. Now, this was not just happening in Palestine. I want to mention the Hebrew newspaper Adoar. Next slide. The Hebrew newspaper Adoar in New York did the same. And there you have Daniel Persky, the feuilletonist, which was actually more widely read and influential than probably most American Hebraist poets and novelists, people like Shimon Halkin and many other poets. People, when they read in New York and other places in America this newspaper, they wanted to read Daniel Persky the same way that people in the Yishuv read Alterman and Atur HaShvi'i and his Feuilleton. So it was very popular and very influential. This time was the peak of Feuilleton writing in the interwar period. German and Austrian Jewish writers such as Joseph Roth, Siegfried Krakauer, Walter Benjamin, as well as Polish Jewish writers like Julian Tuvim and Antoni Slominski wrote feuilletons and that defined and reflected the new political and cultural era and the new visual media gaining a prominence. So what happens when we move from the 30s and 40s into the 50s and beyond? Like in most places around the world, the Hebrew feuilleton gradually lost its status and appeal in Israeli newspaper in the second half of the 20th century. In the early 1950s, we can still see people like Dan Ben Amotz and Amos Keinan, who write satirical feuilletons in Davar, the socialist Zionist newspaper. However, the genre flourished maybe more in the newspaper of the Communist Party, and also Cherut, the right-wing newspaper. Feuilletons were very popular in the 50s and early 60s, as well as, I'm sure many people are familiar with the Hungarian satirist Ephraim Kishon, who had this Chad Gadya feature, column in Ma'ariv, for many, many years, which was very popular. And I want to end the lecture with asking a question. Is there still a Hebrew or Israeli feuilleton today in the 21st century? Has anything replaced it? I think this is an open question that we can discuss, but I wanna give the thought that maybe, if you can move to the last slide, we can think of the Palestinian Arab writer Sayed Kashua and the Hebrew weekly columns in Haaretz, which he was writing until recently, he doesn't write them anymore, as a heir of the Jewish feuilletons in contemporary Israel. This is in spite of the fact that Kashua does not write below the line, and his reader would probably hardly recognize the word feuilleton. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shachar, for this really intriguing presentation. I really loved it and learned a lot from it. And I hope you can also.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
You can't hear me. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to raise my voice. Unfortunately, I want to tell everybody here that Professor Pinsker needs to leave a little earlier than usual because he starts teaching at 4 our time, 10 a.m. in Michigan. Without further ado, let's all move to the Q&As. I'm going to collect questions and comments 3 at a time. So if you're interested in asking a question or commenting something, please use the chat. Okay, put down your name, and I'll let people speak according to the order their names appear in the chat. Okay, so please do that now. Go ahead and do it. And also, when you speak, please present yourself. Okay, to our host, to our guest today, because he wants to know you, understand.
Yeah, just one sentence. Tell me who you are, your name, and what you're working on and where you're from.
So I can see Aryeh Sapozhnik. He's the only one. Kobe. Okay, let's get another name and then we'll go to to Aryeh. Okay, we don't have another name, so Aryeh, please.
Hi, thank you, Shachar. So a few questions. I'll begin actually. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So let me begin actually with what I had actually written as my last question, but it's sort of related to the question that you left us with. And it is, I wonder if you can say something about your thoughts about the decline of the Feuilleton as a form, or whether in fact it has declined, and whether it exists under other names. But although I think you're correct that few of us actually know the term anymore, I wonder if you can reflect on why it may have disappeared, if it has in fact disappeared, and what meanings we might garner from that. But quickly, just a few other things. If you can say a word about differences in the development between Hebrew and Yiddish Feuilleton. And related to that, my last question, if you can make a few general remarks about the importance of the form in the development of a modern Jewish politics.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. These are big questions. So let me answer them in the order, and actually start from the end. So the only place that people still recognize the form, the word Feuilleton, and it's still functioning is in Germany and German-speaking countries. But even there, it kind of lost the specific meaning that I'm talking about, and people use the Feuilleton as like the cultural section of the newspaper, right? It's not a specific place or genre or form. And I think that it really, it's something that is very much related to the 19th century, the place in the newspaper, and still was very strong in the first half of the 20th century. And then somehow it's not that the function of the Feuilleton, like people still write that kind of something that is personal, that is between journalism and literature and speak to the audience, but it's not, it can be anywhere in newspaper, it can be in many other places, right? And I think that it was recognized, like people didn't need to see the word Feuilleton to recognize the form, right? So, for example, when Alterman was writing in Haaretz and in Davar and in other newspaper, the form of the Feuilleton was still on his mind. By the 50s and 60s, it stopped all over the world becoming something that people recognize. And when people stop recognizing it, this is kind of definition of genre. You don't really know what to expect as in terms of the readers, and there's still people like Michael Handelzalt and other people in Israel who speak about the Feuilleton, but that's because they still remember it, right? And when we move to the end of the 20th century, I don't think anyone is really kind of familiar with it unless you're a scholar and historian and, read these wonderful texts from the 19th and early 20th century. So I agree with you that it hasn't disappeared, and that's why I brought maybe the example of somebody like Sayed Kashua, right? The kind of writing that he writes is very similar to the Feuilleton, but people don't recognize it, and I don't think he himself may be familiar with the genre, right? The difference between Hebrew and Yiddish, it's a big question. I think that one way to think about it is that the Yiddish press, unlike the Hebrew press, is so wild. It became so widespread all over the world that maybe you can say like the Feuilleton took over sometimes the entire newspaper or big chunks of the newspaper. Also something that became very strong in Yiddish and did not catch so much in Hebrew was this genre of the Roman Feuilleton, the serialized novel. So I spoke about Sholem Aleichem. If you think about Menachem Mendel, which was very popular, it was published in the newspaper as kind of big, sprawling Roman Feuilleton, and nothing like this really happened in Hebrew. And it's interesting to think why. I think that, the Yiddish newspaper mostly spoke to really huge audience. Think about something like the Forwards in New York, and, Hebrew newspapers were always small, until maybe the last 30, 40 years when you have millions of people reading newspapers. So it's different kind of audience. And your question about politics, I think that the Feuilletons was very important for politics. And I'm just going to leave you with one thing. Herzl and Jabotinsky, two of the most important political figures, founders of Zionism and thinkers of Zionism. When you see what they wrote, not in the Jewish sphere, but in the general sphere, right? In German and in Russian, people mostly knew them and read them as writers of feuilletons, right? Herzl in German, in the Neue Freie Presse, and Jabotinsky in Russian, right? So it's really interesting, and people like Derek Pensler wrote about it recently, and other people are writing about Jabotinsky, how these people who are very important for Jewish politics and for Zionism are speaking in maybe a different tone, right, for general readers. At the same time, when people in the German-speaking and the Russian-speaking sphere read feuilletons, they already connected the feuilletons with Jewishness, right, as I try to show. So it's really interesting, and there's a lot more research and thinking that needs to be done about that very interesting connection between feuilletons and Jewish politics and Zionism as well, which I know is interest for you and many people in this audience.
Thank you, Shachar, very much. We have 4 more questions, so I think we'll take them all at the time. Okay.
Okay.
That will leave us 15 minutes. Okay. Until.
Okay. Great.
Great. So the first question comes from Kobe.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paula, Nahum, and Ilya. Kobe, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm interested in the cultural history of the Middle East and in Palestinians in particular. And I was wondering, first, may I say that the word is associated in my mind with my parents' world. Who would know today what a feuilleton is, but my parents knew and they used that word. But in terms of, or from the point of view of cultural history, it seems to me that your field is full of opportunities because of the specificalities, because of the nature of the source you deal with. And I was wondering, first with regard to language, you mentioned the fact that feuilletons use another kind of language. And my first question is, was Hebrew, in your view, influenced or shaped, and to what extent by the language of the feuilletons, something different, some new spirit brought to the language?
Yes, yes.
And the second question deals with feuilletons and, well, something like real life, if I may say so, the ups and downs, because it seems to me that you'd find feuilletons flourishing when the situation is more difficult, but perhaps I'm wrong. And so I was wondering about the relation between writing the feuilletons and the spirit of the feuilletons and the ups and downs in Jewish history. And my third question relates to Arab newspapers. Thinking of sarcasm and irony, Arab literature and poetry are full with sarcasm and irony, and I know very little about feuilletons or that kind of tone in journalism. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. These are very good questions, and because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to answer them very quickly. So with Hebrew,
can we just take the other 3 questions? So
okay, sure.
So Paula, you're next. Paula, unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Sorry, guys. Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so I'll keep it short. I couldn't avoid myself from thinking that there's humoristic writing or any piece of art that is based on humor, in a way, is harder to maintain over time compared to, I don't know, tragedies. Now, I think, now I'm sharing you my thoughts, and I would like to think, to hear what you think of it. Could it be that the problem with the Feuilleton is that it assumes a solid cultural common denominator? And in a way, so the more the society is split and diverse, it's harder to bring people together around the same sense of humor. That's a thought that I had, and I just wonder what to think about.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah.
Nahum, you're next.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. My question is about the concept of public sphere. Because I was wondering if you have any unity of the various places, Heine writing in German, nobody knows that it's Heine, and Hadar in New York and so forth. So are you thinking about transnationalism or proto-Zionism and so forth? Thank you.
Okay.
Ilya?
All right. So, okay.
Last one. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the Feuilleton and about in its relations to urbanity. You talked about how it's an urban genre, and I wanted to ask if you can define a form of, like, if there is a certain urbanity that is associated with the Feuilleton, and if we would compare it to a different form of literature, of the Romance, for example, is there any defined way of seeing how the city is being viewed through the Feuilleton? And also, if this changes over time and between different places, like the Tel Aviv urbanity compared with Warsaw or New York or something like that.
Okay. So lots of good questions, and I will try very quickly to answer them. So I will start with Kobe's questions. With Hebrew, I think you're absolutely right, and I spoke about it a little bit. I think the Feuilleton in the 19th century, especially in the Haskalah period and moving forward, to the beginning of the 20th century, really had the effect of changing Hebrew, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Tzederboim and so many newspapers wanted to have the Feuilleton, right? They saw that Feuilleton is very popular in newspapers around the world, and they knew that for the Haskalah writers, writing Hebrew, it's very didactic, it's very heavy, and the combination of that caused really the Feuilleton to change Hebrew, to make it more light, to make it more connected to the everyday, to the urban, to the humorous side. So it really had an effect of changing Hebrew and making it more useful, more, this is before, of course, the idea of Hebrew as a spoken language. And, this issue of like the real life and what kind of conditions you need to have the Feuilleton, and if it needs. It's an interesting question. I mean, the Feuilleton became kind of, unlike genres, maybe I'll connect it to the last question that Ilya asked. Unlike the novel, the romance, it's a new genre. It's a modern genre. It's something that can change, and it's a very elastic, So people can change it according to the needs. And the moment that it kind of becomes clear, okay, what a Feuilleton is and what it should be like, suddenly it changes, right? And the more actually we have people, I'm looking at David here working on Judeo-Arabic, or people working on Ladino, and, it takes different forms and it changes completely, which also answers the question, I think, of Kobe. I mean, I don't know much about Arab newspapers, but I think that in modernity, with the influence of French and colonial, it comes, people start to see the form of the Feuilleton, and then, you start to see it in the Jewish, in Judeo-Arabic, and I'm sure in Arabic as well. I just don't know enough about it because this is not my area. But I'm really happy to have this collaboration and have people look at different spheres and different languages. And what happens when the Feuilleton moves from Paris and Berlin and Vienna to other new areas, the Ottoman Empire or North Africa or to New York, where it didn't really become very important in like American English newspaper, but the immigrants are bringing it with them. Then there is the question of the humor and the tragedies and the question of like the solid cultural denominator. So, I mean, the truth is that the Feuilleton, I think, originally did not start as a humorous genre, right? In Paris, it really started more as an urban genre, something that is connected to the city and, the big city, the metropolis, and how you understand it, right? And then when it moved with people like Heine and other people, they saw this kind of dialogue that you have with the readers, and also the fact that there was censorship and how you speak in a different way, in a kind of coded way, and it developed in a way that is connected with humor, right? But as Frischman said, with a light touch to speak about very serious topics, right? So yeah, there is a kind of humor aspect, but it's not universal. In some places it's stronger than others. And also there's always this kind of idea that you speak with a light touch, with some humor, but also you speak about, it's a tool for cultural criticism, and think about, Walter Benjamin or Krakauer. It's not something that we would associate with humor, but more with kind of the light touch that enables people to combine cultural criticism with talking about, what's going on in the city, what's going on with new forms of communication like cinema and art. If we come to the question of the public sphere that Nachum was asking about, and this transnational, I think that, of course, the public sphere, the way Habermas is talking about it, this was something that was really in the 18th century, and then he says it was in decline, right, in the 19th century and moving into the 20th century. But when you talk about Jewish public sphere, that was something that slowly started to emerge only in the 19th century, and Jewish press is really important in it. And, when you think about Gordon writing in Hamelitz, or people, they don't think about people in St. Petersburg or people in the Russia. They think about the Jewish public in the world, right? Even if it's not very big, right? This is the way that people, right? And the newspaper did kind of move from one place to another, right? And other writers are. So I think it's really important for us to think about the public sphere and kind of what does Jewish public sphere mean, right? Because you have, this is the question of what is Jewish press, right? On one hand, Jewish press is really the press that is written in Jewish languages by Jews and for Jews. But then, of course, everybody is influenced by people like Heine or Herzl or Joseph Roth, who are not writing for Jewish audience, but because of the Jewishness, they are part of this public sphere. So it's very complex. And I think that by looking at the Feuilleton, which is this kind of specific genre, you really have an opportunity to deal with all these questions and all these different issues. And that's why I think the project really has the potential of teaching us something very big about, Jewish politics, the public sphere, and, different elements that are very central that maybe we couldn't really see in this kind of transnational way. And, you look at what was going on in the Yishuv and early Israel. I think it's really important to see that all these people, they deal with specific problems in the Yishuv and in Israel in the 50s and 60s, but they're bringing into dialogue with what's going on around the world. And that transnational aspect is really important. And then the last question about the genre and the urbanity of the genre. I think it's important. I think it's really you can't understand the Feuilleton, the way it developed, the way it speaks, without understanding the city, and that's why it started in Paris and it moved to Berlin, and then like in our examples when we talk about Feuilletons in the Hebrew newspaper in Palestine and then in Israel, it's mostly about the cities. That's why Alterman is writing about Tel Aviv. Leah Goldberg is writing about, how to understand Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa in relationship with the rest of the world. And even when people talk about kind of political issues, it is within the urban sphere, which is very important. And of course, it's very different from like the Romance. So, it's for me as a literary scholar, it's really interesting to look at people like Alterman or like Gordon or like who are also writers of poetry or fiction, and they write in a different mode when they write feuilletons, right? They could write about in completely different style and about different themes, right? But there is this kind of awareness that this is the genre of the feuilleton. It is connected to the city. It is connected to the world, right? And to modernity. And it's a way to kind of ask, what is the place of Tel Aviv, right? Is Tel Aviv a metropolis together with Paris or not? So this is the kind of materials that we see. But I also want to mention that many of the scholars that we collaborate with also show that, for example, in the Ladino press or in Judeo-Arabic press, sometimes it's a way even, to do different things. Like there is this kind of element that many people started to notice that in the Jewish sphere, the feuilleton is a kind of almost like a modern sermon where when rabbis can take this style. And so it's a very elastic form. It's not a form that has this kind of generic rules, and you can really do it almost anything you want, right? To the degree that people say, okay, then feuilleton means nothing. But I think that it does mean something because people still have this kind of generic memory of where it started from and what people expect when they see a feuilleton. But then it morphs and changes in all kind of really interesting ways. And that's why I'm very excited about the project and comparing, feuilletons in German and Russian and Polish, and what it looks like in Hebrew or in Yiddish or in Ladino and Judeo-Arabic. It looks very, very different, but it still is, there's still connection. There's still something that we can see all these connections.
Shachar, I think you want to freshen up before your class, right? It's
yeah.
We'll unfortunately end this meeting now. And I'm sure people have more questions. I myself have questions, but we can contact you. I can give people your email. And
please.
Yeah, of course. And I hope it will really yield some collaborations, between people in the room. And, hopefully it will expand your project.
Exactly. I was going to say, please look at the website that we shared with you, and we're going to have, even this year, even in the next few months, we're going to have some workshops when people present text in different languages, in the original and in English translation. And this is a project that is it's already in its third year. But in a sense, we are really just at the beginning, because this is really a project that can only be done in collaboration with a lot of people who are experts on specific languages and geographies and specific writers, and there's no way to do it without the collaboration. So if anyone is interested in the topic and, in specific language or newspaper or writer, please get in touch with me and come to our activities and workshops, and this is going to be developed, and hopefully we are going to create a digital collection, not of all the feuilletons, but the feuilletons that we think are important and interesting for historical reasons or literary reasons, and we rely on the expertise of people who can tell us why this is important, why this is significant. So I invite anyone who is interested to be in touch with me and to be part of this project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shachar. And please join me in thanking Shachar for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you next time again.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, Shachar.
All right. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.